Imagine a city built on 7 hills above a muddy river, no ocean to hide behind, no desert fortress protecting its flanks, no natural harbor funneling the wealth of the world to its docks, just hills, and a river that flooded every spring, and people stubborn enough to stay anyway. And yet, from that unlikely place, from that ordinary bend in the Tiber River in central Italy, there grew something the world had never seen before and has never quite seen since. An empire that stretched from the frozen moors of northern Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Mesopotamia, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the banks of the Euphrates, a civilization so vast, so durable, so deeply threaded into the fabric of everything that came after it, that you cannot understand the modern world without first understanding Rome. The roads beneath European cities, the laws that protect you in a courtroom, the calendar you check every morning, the alphabet your eyes are moving across right now, the months of the year, the words justice, liberty, republic, senate, all of it carries the fingerprints of a city that was founded, according to ancient tradition, in the year 753 BC. This is not a lecture, this is the full story, told the way it deserves to be told, from the very beginning, when Rome was nothing more than a handful of mud huts on a hilltop above a muddy river, to the last ember of an empire that refused, for over 1,000 years, to go out, settle in, let the world grow quiet. Tonight, we go back to the beginning. Part 1. Wolves and Kings. Before Rome was an empire, before it was a republic, before it was even a proper city, it was a story, and like all great stories, it begins with brothers. The legend goes like this. A princess named Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin of the Latin city of Alba Longa, was visited by the god Mars. From that union, she gave birth to twin boys. Their names were Romulus and Remus. Their great-uncle, a king named Amulius, who had stolen the throne from their grandfather, saw the twins as a threat. He ordered them thrown into the Tiber River, but the servant tasked with carrying out the order could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he placed the boys in a basket and set them adrift on the water. The basket came to rest at the foot of a hill, the Palatine Hill, as the Romans would later call it, where the twins were found by a she-wolf. And here, the story takes its most famous turn. Rather than eating them, the wolf nursed them. She kept them alive, these 2 small, impossible children, until a shepherd named Faustulus found them and brought them home to raise as his own. The Romans told this story for centuries. They carved it into stone. They cast it in bronze. The image of the she-wolf with 2 small boys at her side became the most recognized symbol in Roman history. Fierce, nurturing, and just a little dangerous. You can still find that image in Rome today. Now, most historians treat the founding myth of Romulus and Remus as exactly that, a myth. But myths are not nothing. Myths are how a people explain who they are, where they come from, and what they believe about themselves. And the myth Rome chose to tell about its own birth is extraordinarily revealing. Rome began, in its own imagination, with violence and survival, with divine ancestry and mortal struggle, with brothers who should have died and did not, and with a wolf, not a gentle dove, not a god on a mountaintop, but a predator, as the creature that chose to protect them. Keep that image in mind. It will explain a great deal about what comes next. The twins grew up strong. They discovered who they were. They overthrew Amulius, restored their grandfather to his throne. And then, because men like that are never satisfied with what they have been given, they set out to found a city of their own. They chose the hills where the wolf had found them. But then came the oldest question in the history of power. Who would be in charge? They agreed to let the gods decide. Each brother climbed a different hill and watched for omens in the form of birds. Remus, on the Aventine hill, saw 6 vultures. Romulus, on the Palatine, claimed to have seen 12. Who had truly won was disputed. Arguments turned to violence. The ancient sources differ on exactly what happened, some saying it was a scuffle, others a deliberate act. But the outcome was the same. Romulus killed his brother. He drew a furrow in the earth to mark the boundary of his new city, Remus. According to the tradition, the Romans preserved, mocked it by jumping over the line. Romulus struck him down. So perish, he is said to have declared. In the words the historian Livy later recorded, "Whoever else shall leap over my walls." Rome was founded in blood, and it never entirely forgot that. The city Romulus built was small. Archaeological evidence confirms that the hills around the Tiber were inhabited from at least the 10th century BC, with denser settlement developing around the 8th century BC, roughly in line with the founding date the Romans themselves used. These were not gleaming marble buildings. They were thatched roof huts on muddy hills, home to Iron Age farmers and herders who spoke an early form of Latin and smelled of wood smoke and livestock. But the location was not accidental. The Tiber River was navigable from this point. The hills provided natural defense. The river island just downstream offered a natural crossing point where trade routes running north to south and inland to the coast converged. In the ancient world, whoever controlled that crossing had leverage. Rome, from its very first days, sat on leverage. The Romans themselves counted 7 kings who ruled the city between its founding and 509 BC. When the monarchy was overthrown, some of these kings may be partly legendary, composite figures given names and dates by later historians. But the period they represent is real, and it left marks that lasted for the rest of Roman history. The early kings shaped Rome in ways both practical and spiritual. Numa Pompilius, remembered not as a warrior but as a priest, gave Rome its religious calendar and its sacred rituals, establishing the idea that the city had a special, ongoing relationship with the gods that had to be carefully maintained. Tullus Hostilius destroyed Alba Longa itself, the very city from which the founders had come, and absorbed its people into Rome. Ancus Marcius expanded to the coast, founding the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber, and then came the Etruscans. The Etruscans were the dominant civilization of central Italy in this period, literate, artistically sophisticated, and considerably more advanced than the Latin tribes to their south. The last 3 kings of Rome, according to tradition, were either Etruscan or deeply Etruscan in character, and their influence transformed the city. Under Etruscan influence, Rome became something that actually resembled a unified urban centre, the marshy valley between the hills. The area that would become the Roman Forum was drained. The first great temple rose on the Capitoline Hill. Rome acquired sewers, public spaces, and the visual language of power that the Etruscans had perfected over generations. The Romans absorbed all of it, and then, with a talent they would demonstrate again and again throughout their history, they made it entirely their own. The last Etruscan king was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He was, by every surviving account, a tyrant in the most literal sense. He ruled by fear. He executed political opponents without trial. He treated the Roman people as subjects rather than citizens. His reign ebbed at battle but with a crime. His son Sextus violated a noblewoman named Lucretia. She told her father and her husband what had happened, made them swear an oath of revenge. And then, in an act that Roman tradition remembered for centuries, took her own life. Her kinsman, Lucius Junius Brutus, a man who had survived the Reign of Terror by pretending to be a simpleton, whose very name meant something close to the dull one, took her body to the Forum and used it as a rallying point. The outrage was total. The king and his family were expelled. It was 509 BC. Rome would never have a king again. That was not merely a political fact. It was a psychological one, burned so deeply into the Roman character that it would shape decisions made 500 years later. The word king, rex in Latin, became one of the most dangerous words in the Roman vocabulary. Centuries later, when Julius Caesar was offered a crown in public, he pushed it away 3 times. Not because he didn't want power, because he understood that the word attached to that crown carried centuries of Roman fury behind it. The expulsion of Tarquin did not just end a dynasty, it ended a way of thinking about power. And what replaced it? The Roman Republic was one of the most consequential political inventions in all of human history. But that is where our next chapter begins. For now, sit with this a moment. 7 hills, a muddy river, a wolf's milk and a brother's blood. From this, everything else would grow. Part 2. The Republic rises. The Romans did not replace their king with another king. They replaced him with 2, and gave each one the power to cancel the other out. It sounds almost absurd when you put it that way, but that is precisely what the Roman Republic did, and the elegance of the idea is worth pausing on. The 2 chief magistrates of the new republic were called consuls. They were elected annually. They held equal power, and each had the absolute right to veto, from the Latin word meaning "I forbid" any decision the other made. One man alone could not drag Rome into a war, seize public funds, or appoint his allies to positions of power without the other man simply saying no. It was a system built entirely around one foundational fear, the fear of what had just happened. The Romans had looked at monarchy and decided, collectively, that the cure for bad kings was not better kings. The cure was a system that made kings impossible. This was, for its time, a revolutionary idea. The republic that emerged from the expulsion of the Tarquins was not a democracy. Not in any sense we would recognize today. It was, in its early form, a government of, by, and for the wealthy landowning families of Rome. The patricians. These were the old noble families whose ancestors had supposedly sat in Romulus's first Senate. They controlled the consulship. They controlled the Senate. They controlled the priesthoods, everyone else. The vast majority of Romans, the farmers and craftsmen and traders and laborers, were called plebeians. And, in the early republic, they had almost no say in how the city was governed. This was not a stable arrangement. What followed was a long, grinding, and remarkably persistent struggle that the Romans themselves called the conflict of the orders. It lasted, in various forms, for nearly 2 centuries. It was not a revolution in the dramatic sense. No single battle, no single moment when everything changed. Instead, it was a slow accumulation of pressure, negotiation, and hard-won reform. The plebeians had one weapon the patricians could not easily counter: their sheer numbers, and the threat of simply walking away. On at least 2 occasions, the plebeians did exactly that. They left Rome. They walked out of the city and camped on a hill outside, refusing to work, refusing to fight, refusing to participate in the civic life that depended on them. The Romans called this the secession of the plebs, and it was devastatingly effective. A city whose lower classes have collectively decided to stop cooperating is a city that stops functioning very quickly. The patricians needed the plebeians to plant their fields, build their buildings, and, most urgently, fill the ranks of their army. Concessions were made. The first and most important was the creation of the tribune of the plebs, an elected official chosen by and from the plebeian class, whose person was declared sacrosanct, untouchable, protected by religious law. To lay a hand on a tribune was not just a crime, it was a sin against the gods themselves. And the tribune held the power to veto any action by any magistrate that threatened plebeian citizens. Then came something even more fundamental. Around 450 BC, after years of plebeian pressure, Rome's laws were written down for the first time. Before this, the law had been largely unwritten, interpreted by patrician priests who could, and sometimes did, adjust it quietly to suit the powerful. The new code, inscribed on 12 bronze tablets and displayed publicly in the forum for anyone to read, became known as the 12 Tables. It was not a perfect document. It was not an egalitarian one, but it was a law that applied to everyone and could be read by anyone, which meant it could no longer be quietly changed to suit whoever happened to be in charge. Slowly, over generations, more offices opened to plebeians, the right to marry patricians, the right to hold priesthoods. Eventually, in 366 BC, the right to hold the consulship itself. By the end of the conflict of the orders, Rome had built something genuinely remarkable, a mixed constitution distributing power across multiple institutions, with checks and counterweights at almost every level. The Greek historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, would describe the Roman constitution as the most balanced form of government he had ever observed. A blend of monarchic elements in the consuls, aristocratic elements in the Senate, and democratic elements in the popular assemblies. He called it the secret of Roman power. History has largely agreed with him. But while Rome was solving its internal politics, it was doing something else, something that would define it far more dramatically than any constitutional reform. It was learning how to fight. The Rome of the early Republic was surrounded by enemies. Etruscans to the north, fierce Samnite hill tribes to the south and east, and dozens of other city-states and tribal confederacies scattered across the peninsula, each with their own ambitions. Rome fought them all, not always successfully. In 390 BC, a Celtic tribe known as the Gauls sacked the city itself, an event so traumatic that the Romans kept a special day of annual mourning for it on their calendar for centuries. But Rome absorbed defeat in a way most ancient cities could not. It did not collapse. It did not scatter. It learned, rebuilt, and returned. What made Rome's military exceptional was not just courage or discipline, though it had both. It was the way Rome treated the people it defeated. Most ancient empires simply dominated the conquered, extracted tribute, imposed governors, kept the defeated in permanent subjugation. Rome did something different. Rome, with remarkable frequency, incorporated the defeated into itself. Conquered Latin cities received Roman citizenship or something close to it. Defeated enemies became allies, and those allies were expected to contribute soldiers to Roman armies. Every war Rome won made its next war easier. The army that conquered the Samnites was larger than the one that started the war, because it now included Samnite soldiers marching under Roman standards. The empire, before it ever called itself an empire, was self-reinforcing in a way no rival could match. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, Rome controlled the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po River. A collection of villages on 7 hills had become, in just over 2 centuries, the master of a unified Italy. It was an achievement without parallel in the ancient Mediterranean. But Italy was not the world, and just across the narrow strip of water at the toe of the Italian boot, there was another power, older, wealthier, and not remotely impressed by Rome's recent success. Its name was Carthage, and it was about to teach Rome things about war that no enemy ever had. Part 3. The Wars That Made an Empire. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a harbour, not a small harbour, an enormous one, engineered, but a Caesar, built to hold the largest war fleet in the ancient Mediterranean, circular, a central island ringed by berths for over 200 warships, each sheltered under its own covered dock. Above the harbour master's tower, you can see, on a clear day, the blue shimmer of the sea. The air smells of salt and pitch and cedarwood. Somewhere nearby, in the furnaces of the city's workshops, bronze is being shaped into rams for new ships. This is Carthage. Not the ruins that remain today beneath the suburbs of modern Tunis in North Africa, but Carthage at its height, a city of several 100,000 people, the centre of a commercial empire that controlled the major islands of the Western Mediterranean and maintained a navy so powerful that it effectively owned the sea. Its merchants were everywhere. Its wealth was legendary. And in 264 BC, Rome stumbled into its orbit. The collision began almost by accident. A dispute on the island of Sicily, where Carthaginian interests had long been established. Neither side had particularly wanted a major war. But once the first blows were struck, neither side could afford to back down. What followed was the First Punic War, Punic being the Latin word for Phoenician, which is what Carthage's founders had originally been. It lasted 23 years, and its most remarkable feature was not the fighting itself, but what Rome chose to do in order to win. Rome, in 264 BC, had virtually no navy. It was a land power, through and through. Its soldiers were among the finest infantry fighters in the known world. But the sea was not their element. Carthage, meanwhile, had been a maritime power for centuries. Its sailors were professionals. Its warships were the finest in the Mediterranean. Any rational strategic analysis would have said, do not fight at sea. Rome built a fleet. Within a few years, Rome had constructed hundreds of warships, reportedly using a captured Carthaginian vessel as a template, essentially reverse engineering the enemy's technology, which was itself a very Roman thing to do. And then they invented something, a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge, a spiked plank mounted on a rotating pole that could be dropped onto an enemy ship's deck and locked the two vessels together. The Romans could not yet match Carthaginian sailors in open water maneuvering, but they could turn a naval battle into something that looked very much like a land battle. Two ships locked side by side, Roman soldiers pouring across the bridge with their swords drawn, fighting on their terms. It worked. The First Punic War ended in 241 BC with a Roman victory. Carthage ceded Sicily. Rome collected an enormous indemnity, and a Carthaginian general named Hamilcar Barca, who had fought brilliantly in the war's final stages, returned home to a city that was humiliated, impoverished, and burning with fury. Hamilcar had a son. That son's name was Hannibal. Hannibal Barca is one of those figures in history who transcends the category of military commander and becomes something closer to a force of nature. He was brilliant, cold-blooded, deeply charismatic, and possessed of a strategic imagination that most of his contemporaries could barely comprehend. Ancient tradition holds that he swore an oath as a small child, on his knees before the altar of the gods, that he would spend his life as an enemy of Rome. Whether that story is literally true, the sentiment behind it was real. He had grown up watching his father's defeat. He intended to reverse it. When the Second Punic War erupted in 218 BC, Rome expected to fight in Spain and North Africa. in Carthaginian territory, on Carthaginian terms. Far from Italy, Rome would bring the war to Carthage. That was the plan. Hannibal had a different plan. He would bring the war to Rome. What he did next remains one of the most audacious military maneuvers in recorded history. He assembled an army. Ancient sources give varying figures, but likely somewhere around 90,000 soldiers when the campaign began, including cavalry and dozens of war elephants, those enormous animals being the ancient world's equivalent of armored vehicles, terrifying to horses and devastating to infantry formations that had never faced them. He marched this army north through Spain, across the south of what is now France, and then, in the late autumn, when the passes were already becoming treacherous with ice and snow, up into the Alps, the crossing nearly destroyed him. The terrain was brutal beyond anything his men had prepared for. Mountain tribes attacked the column from above, rolling boulders down onto men and animals. The cold was killing. The paths were barely paths at all, more like suggestions of paths, crumbling away under the weight of an army. Men and horses and elephants fell into ravines. By the time Hannibal descended into the Po Valley in northern Italy, he had lost a third of his men or more, and most of his elephants. But he was in Italy. The shock in Rome was total. This was not supposed to be possible. 2 Roman armies marched out to meet him. Hannibal destroyed them both at the Trebia River in December of 218 BC. He lured a Roman army into crossing a freezing river at dawn, fighting cold and wet and hungry against fresh Carthaginian troops on the opposite bank. The Roman casualties were catastrophic. Then at Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, in the grey fog of an early morning, he ambushed an entire Roman army on a narrow road between the lake and the hills. The Carthaginians were waiting on the slopes above, hidden in the mist. The Romans marched straight into the trap. Ancient sources suggest perhaps 15,000 men died in less than 3 hours. The consul commanding them was killed in the fighting. His body was never found. Rome was shaken to its foundations. But Rome did not break. Instead, it appointed a dictator, a legal emergency measure in the Roman constitution, a cautious general named Quintus Fabius Maximus, who earned the nickname Cunctator, meaning the delayer. Fabius refused to engage Hannibal in open battle. He shadowed the Carthaginian army, harassed its supply lines, picked off isolated detachments, avoided pitched engagement. It was strategically sound and politically excruciating. The Romans called it cowardice. They wanted a fight. In 216 BC, they got one. At a small town in southern Italy called Cannae, 2 Roman consuls led the largest army Rome had ever assembled into the field. Ancient sources estimate around 70,000 Roman soldiers against perhaps 50,000 Carthaginians. The numbers favoured Rome. The ground was flat and open. This was supposed to be the battle that ended the war. What happened at Cannae became a case study in military tactics that is still taught in military academies around the world today, and has been, without interruption, for 2,000 years. Hannibal deliberately weakened his centre while strengthening his flanks with his best cavalry and African infantry. The Romans drove forward into the centre, exactly as he predicted, feeling the momentum of victory, pushing deeper as the Carthaginian line bent back. But as they pushed, the flanks swung inward on both sides, like a hand closing into a fist. The Roman army found itself encircled, packed so tightly that soldiers at the centre could barely raise their arms to swing a sword. By the end of that day, ancient sources report that somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Roman soldiers were dead. The figures from ancient historians are always imprecise, but even the most conservative modern estimates place the casualties in the tens of thousands. Killed in a single afternoon: senators, knights, ordinary soldiers, The consul Aemilius Paulus, who had argued against the battle, died in the fighting. His colleague, Varro, who had demanded it, fled. Cannae remains, by any measure, one of the worst military defeats in recorded history. And it did not end Rome. This is the moment that tells you everything about what the Roman Republic actually was. After Cannae, several of Rome's Italian allies defected to Hannibal. The great city of Capua switched sides. Philip V of Macedon signed an alliance with Carthage. The situation was as dire as it had ever been. The Senate met. Debate was brief. Rome would not seek terms. Rome would not negotiate. It would raise new legions. It would fight on. Roman women were reportedly weeping in the streets and were ordered indoors, because public displays of grief were considered damaging to morale. The Senate passed a decree limiting mourning to 30 days. Life would continue. The war would continue. Hannibal had won every battle, but he was deep in enemy territory, dependent on supply lines stretching thousands of miles back to Spain, without the siege equipment needed to assault major walled cities, and waiting for reinforcements that kept not arriving. He could win battles. He could not win the war. Not like this. The Roman general who understood this most clearly was a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio. He had fought at both Trebia and Cannae. He had seen everything Hannibal could do. And rather than trying to defeat Hannibal in Italy, he proposed something entirely different. Take the war to Africa. Strike at Carthage itself. Force Hannibal to come home. It worked. In 202 BC. At a place called Zama on the North African plain, Scipio met Hannibal in battle for the first and only time. The student against the master. Scipio had studied Hannibal's tactics for years and built specific countermeasures for each one. He won. Decisively. The Second Punic War was over. Carthage survived. Reduced to a dependent client state. Stripped of its fleet. Forbidden from making war without Roman permission. It would limp along for another 50 years. And then, in 146 BC, after decades of pressure from the Roman senator Cato the Elder, who reportedly ended every single speech he gave, regardless of the topic, with the phrase, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Rome found its pretext for a third war. After a 3-year siege, a Roman army broke into the city and destroyed it utterly. The buildings were torn down stone by stone. The surviving population was enslaved. The harbour was filled in. The ground was formally cursed. The story that the Romans salted the earth so nothing would grow is almost certainly a later embellishment. But the spirit of it is historically accurate. Rome did not merely defeat Carthage. It erased it. In that same year, 146 BC, Rome also sacked the great Greek city of Corinth and left it rubble. 2 great civilizations. Gone in a single year. The message was unmistakable. Rome was no longer simply the strongest power in the Mediterranean. It was becoming something the ancient world had not quite seen before. A state so dominant, so relentless, so capable of absorbing punishment and returning it, multiplied, that its supremacy had begun to feel less like a political fact and more like a law of nature. But power has a price, and the wars that made Rome an empire were quietly making something else. A wound at the heart of the Republic that no army could fight, no general could outmaneuver, and no Senate decree could heal. That wound was opening in the streets of Rome, in the gap between the men who had gotten rich from the wars and the men who had fought them. It would prove, in the end, more dangerous than Hannibal ever was. Part 4. Blood on the Forum. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean world, and the Mediterranean world had, quietly and irreversibly, begun to conquer Rome back. The wars against Carthage, against Macedonia, against the kingdoms of the Greek East. They had been fought by Roman soldiers, men from small farms across Italy who left their fields in spring, marched to wherever the Senate pointed them, fought through the summer, and came home in autumn to bring in whatever harvest remained. That was the arrangement. That was how it had always worked. But the wars of the 2nd century BC were different. They were longer. They were farther away. A soldier sent to Spain in 170 BC might not see his farm again for 6 years, 7 years, sometimes never. And while he was gone, his farm did not wait for him. It fell into debt. Creditors moved in. Land was sold. And who was buying? The men who had gotten rich from the wars. Senators, merchants, aristocratic families who had used their connections and capital to profit from military contracts, from the plunder of conquered cities, from the slave trade that the wars had made enormously profitable, because the wars had produced something else, alongside conquest and glory. They had produced slaves. Ancient sources suggest hundreds of thousands of prisoners taken in the Macedonian and Punic Wars, marched back to Italy in chains and put to work on vast estates. These estates were called latifundia, worked by enslaved people who could not leave, could not strike, could not demand wages. They undercut the small farmer at every turn. A free man trying to grow grain on a modest plot could not compete with a senator's 1,000-acre estate worked by hundreds of enslaved workers. And so the small farmers, the backbone of the Roman army, the class of independent landowners the Republic had always depended upon, were being ground out of existence. They drifted toward the cities, toward Rome itself. Mostly, they became the urban poor, landless, angry, available, and waiting for someone to tell them their anger was justified. 2 men tried to do exactly that. They were brothers, and their story is one of the most consequential and heartbreaking in Roman history. Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BC. He was not a revolutionary. He was a member of one of Rome's most distinguished families. Educated, well-connected, genuinely alarmed by what he saw happening to the Republic's citizen class. His proposal was moderate by any reasonable standard. There was a law already on the books, long ignored, limiting how much public land any single Roman could hold. Tiberius proposed enforcing it. The excess land would be redistributed to landless citizens. The Senate erupted. The law threatened the holdings of its own members. When a fellow tribune named Octavius vetoed the reform, Tiberius did something controversial. He used his authority to have Octavius removed from office, then passed his land bill. It was legal. It was within the bounds of a tribune's power, but it felt, to many Romans, like a violation of something deeper than law. The unspoken rules, the mutual restraint that kept politics from becoming war. When Tiberius announced he would stand for re-election, another step beyond established convention, the Senate moved. During a public assembly on the Capitoline Hill, a group of senators and their clients armed themselves with whatever was at hand: clubs, the broken legs of chairs, fragments of benches, and waded into the crowd. Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death. So were some 300 of his supporters. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. It was the first time in nearly 4 centuries of the Republic that a Roman politician had been killed by other Romans in a political dispute. It would not be the last. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother Gaius took up the cause and expanded it. Land reform, grain subsidies for the urban poor, new colonies for the landless, a proposal to extend Roman citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. Gaius was more skilled than his brother, more charismatic, more strategically sophisticated, more difficult to simply outmaneuver. He was re-elected tribune. The Senate destroyed him anyway. Through a combination of political manipulation and organized violence, his coalition was broken apart. Gaius fled across the Tiber. Rather than be captured, he ordered a loyal slave to kill him. 3,000 of his supporters were subsequently arrested and executed without trial. The Gracchi were gone. Their reforms were largely reversed. The Senate had won, but something had changed that could not be changed back. The Republic had established a precedent. That political violence worked. That if you had enough armed men and enough nerve, you could solve a political problem by killing the people who represented it. That idea, once introduced, spread like slow poison, and into this poisoned atmosphere walked a man who would transform how Rome made war, and in doing so, transform how Rome made politics. His name was Gaius Marius. He was from a small town in central Italy, not from one of the great families, not from the aristocracy. He was new money, blunt, rough-edged, contemptuous of the senatorial elite's pretensions, and possessed of military ability that his peers could not match or ignore. He was elected consul in 107 BC, an almost unprecedented achievement for a man of his background. He faced an immediate military problem. He needed soldiers, but the traditional pool of eligible soldiers, property-owning citizens, had been shrinking for decades, for precisely the reasons the Gracchi had tried to address. Marius opened the legions to the landless poor. This seems like an administrative decision. In reality, it was one of the most consequential moments in Roman history. Before Marius, a Roman soldier was a citizen farmer who fought when called upon and returned to his land when the campaign ended. After Marius, Roman soldiers were professionals, men who had no land to return to, who served for 16 or 17 years, who received their equipment from the state, and who looked to their general to provide for them when their service was done. Land, a pension, a future, not to the Senate, not to Rome, to their general. You can see exactly where this leads. It leads to Sulla. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was a patrician general of considerable ability and ferocious ambition. In 88 BC, a political rival arranged to have his prestigious Eastern military command transferred to the aging Marius through a popular vote. Sulla did something that no Roman had done since the Gauls had entered the city 2 centuries earlier. He marched his army on Rome. His soldiers followed him, because they were his soldiers, trained by him, loyal to him, dependent on him for their future. The Senate's nightmare had arrived. A Roman army, commanded by a Roman general, advancing on the Roman capital to settle a political disagreement. The city was taken. Sulla's opponents were killed or fled. He then departed to fight his war in the east, leaving Rome in unstable hands. Marius returned while he was gone, took the city back, declared himself consul for the 7th time, died of fever weeks later. Then Sulla came back. What followed was Rome's first systematic political terror. Sulla introduced the proscription, public lists posted in the forum, naming men declared enemies of the state. Their property was forfeit. Their lives were forfeit. Anyone could kill them and collect a reward. Hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy Romans appeared on those lists. Their heads were displayed in the forum. Their children were barred from public life. Rome learned what it meant to live in fear of your own government. Then Sulla did something unexpected. He reformed the constitution, strengthened the Senate, limited the tribune's power, and resigned. He retired to the country, wrote his memoirs, and died a year later. Rome was left to repair itself. It had survived, but it was not the same republic it had been before the Gracchi, before Marius, before the first club was raised on the Capitoline Hill. It was now a republic that had learned the lesson that the next generation of ambitious men was waiting to apply. That one man, if he was bold enough, ruthless enough, and had an army loyal to him personally, could take Rome for himself. 3 men in particular had drawn that lesson clearly. 3 men of extraordinary ability, extraordinary ambition, and very different kinds of power. Their names were Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, and they were about to change everything. Part 5. 3 Men and a Republic. In 73 BC, a man named Spartacus escaped from a gladiatorial training school near the city of Capua with 78 others, armed with kitchen knives and whatever they could carry. Within a year, he commanded an army. Ancient sources give wildly varying numbers, but by most accounts, somewhere between 70 and 120,000 men and women had joined the rebellion. Escaped slaves, rural labourers, the desperate poor of southern Italy. Spartacus defeated Roman army after Roman army. He marched the length of Italy and back for 2 years. The greatest military power in the Western world could not suppress him. The man who finally did was Marcus Licinius Crassus, and he did so with the methodical brutality Rome reserved for those who had shaken its sense of order. After Spartacus died in battle in 71 BC, his body never identified in the carnage, Crassus lined the Appian Way, the great road from Capua to Rome, with 6,000 crucifixes. The crosses stretched for over 100 miles. The bodies were left to hang as a message to every enslaved person in Italy. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome. His fortune had been built through property speculation, silver mines, and, in a detail that says something about his character, ownership of Rome's only firefighting crew, which would arrive at a burning building, negotiate a purchase price with the terrified owner, and only then begin fighting the flames. A general named Pompey arrived from Spain just in time to mop up the last survivors of Spartacus's forces and claimed credit for ending the rebellion. Both men made themselves consul. These two dominated Rome in the decade that followed. They were not friends. They were rivals who tolerated each other because they needed each other. Crassus had money, more than anyone else in Rome. Pompey had military glory. He had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in an astonishing 3-month campaign, reorganized the eastern provinces into a revenue-generating system that transformed Roman finances, and returned to Rome as the conquering hero of a generation. Between them they had wealth and military prestige. What they lacked was political leverage, a way of exercising power through the system rather than simply intimidating it. That was where Julius Caesar came in. Gaius Julius Caesar was, at the turn of the 1st century BC, a promising politician from an ancient but not especially wealthy family, spending money he did not have at a spectacular rate, throwing lavish parties, funding public games, building monuments, cultivating supporters across every class of Roman society. He was charming, intellectually brilliant, and driven by an ambition he never bothered to disguise. His family claimed descent from the goddess Venus, and there is no surviving record of Caesar treating that claim as a metaphor. He was also the only man in Rome who could see what Crassus and Pompey couldn't quite see on their own. That together, they controlled enough money and military force to remake Roman politics entirely. They just needed someone to organize the arrangement. In 60 BC, the 3 men formed what historians call the First Triumvirate. There was no public announcement, no formal document. It was a private agreement, sealed in the traditional Roman way, through family. Caesar gave his daughter Julia in marriage to Pompey. By all accounts, it was a genuine love match. One of the few warm elements in an otherwise cold political calculation, the arrangement worked. Caesar became consul in 59 BC and used the office to push through legislation that benefited all 3 partners. Pompey got his eastern settlements ratified. Crassus got tax relief for his business interests in Asia. And Caesar, when his consulship ended, got what he had been working toward from the beginning: a military command. In 58 BC, Caesar crossed the Alps into Gaul, into what is now France, with 4 legions. Over the next 8 years, he fought more than 50 battles, besieged dozens of fortified towns, and conquered most of what is now France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Switzerland. He led his forces twice across the Channel into Britain, the first Roman commander ever to do so. He built a bridge across the Rhine River in 10 days, marched his army across it as a demonstration of Roman power to the Germanic tribes on the other side, and then had the bridge dismantled behind him. His own account of these campaigns, the Gallic Wars, written in elegant Latin in the third person, has been used as a teaching text for 2,000 years. He narrates his own legend with perfect composure, as if watching himself from a slight distance. The campaigns were brilliant. They were also, by any honest accounting, accompanied by enormous violence. Ancienne source, including Caesar's own writing, describe mass casualties among Gallic populations. Modern historians debate the figures from ancient accounts vigorously, and the true scale remains uncertain. But the conquest of Gaul was one of the largest military operations in the ancient world, and its human cost was immense. Back in Rome, the triumvirate was coming apart. Julia died in 54 BC. The personal bond between Caesar and Pompey dissolved with her, and in 53 BC, at a place called Carrhae in the Mesopotamian desert, Crassus led a Roman army against the Parthian Empire in the hope of military glory to match anything Caesar had achieved in Gaul. It was a catastrophe. The Parthians were masters of horse archery, cavalry that could fire arrows at full gallop and maintain devastating fire while appearing to retreat. Roman infantry, designed to fight at close quarters, had no effective answer to an enemy that simply would not close the distance. 7 Roman legions were destroyed. Crassus himself was captured and killed. According to a later story recorded by the historian Plutarch, the Parthians poured molten gold into his mouth in a dark joke about his famous greed, though Plutarch himself notes uncertainty about the details. Whether literally true or not, the story travelled through Rome as if it were, which tells you something about how the city felt about the man. With Crassus gone, the alliance reduced to 2 men who had never truly trusted each other and now had no reason to pretend. Pompey drifted toward the Senate, positioning himself as the defender of Republican tradition. The Senate, genuinely terrified of Caesar and his army, sided with Pompey. In January of 49 BC, the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. His political allies attempted to veto the decree. They were told the veto would not be honored. They fled Rome disguised as slaves. Caesar stood at the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy proper, with his army on the northern bank. To cross with armed troops was an act of treason. To cross without them was to walk into Rome defenseless before his enemies. He paused. According to the sources, he thought, he considered, then he said, and the ancient historians give us the words in Greek, the language of culture and literature. Alia iacta est. The die is cast. He crossed. What followed was a civil war, but not the slugging match most people expect. Rome, confronted with Caesar's advancing legions, collapsed almost without resistance. Town after town opened its gates. Pompey, claiming he would raise an army from the Italian countryside, discovered that the Italian countryside had no particular wish to fight Caesar. He abandoned Rome. He crossed to Greece. He tried to regroup. Caesar entered the city without bloodshed. The war played out across the entire Mediterranean world. Spain, Greece, North Africa, Egypt. At Pharsalus, in 48 BC, Caesar's veterans met Pompey's larger army and shattered it. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge from the young pharaoh, the Egyptians, calculating with cold precision that a dead enemy of Caesar was worth more than a living one. Had Pompey murdered as he stepped from his boat onto the Egyptian shore, they sent his head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar, upon receiving it, reportedly wept. Whatever he had wanted from this war, it had not been this. In Egypt, Caesar met Cleopatra. The story of her arrival, wrapped in a linen bundle, carried past enemy guards, is preserved by the historian Plutarch, who acknowledges he is repeating a popular account. And whether literally true or not, it perfectly captures the audacity of the woman. She was not simply beautiful. She was the only Ptolemaic ruler to have learned the Egyptian language. She spoke 9 languages in total. She was politically astute, intellectually formidable, and fighting for her survival. Caesar supported her. They became allies. And more than allies. She bore him a son, then more campaigns. Africa, Spain, the loose ends of a civil war that had scattered across the known world. Caesar tied them up, un by un. By 45 BC, he was back in Rome. The last man standing, he was appointed dictator for life. He moved with extraordinary speed. A new calendar, debt relief, colonial settlements for his veterans, the redesign of the forum, reforms to provincial administration, grain distribution. Rome was genuinely becoming more functional, more fairly governed, more rationally organized, but it was happening without the Senate's consent, sometimes over the Senate's explicit objection, to men who had grown up in the Republic, men who believed, as Romans had believed for 4 centuries, that no single person should hold this kind of unchecked authority. What Caesar was doing was not reform. It was tyranny. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, the Ides of March, Julius Caesar walked to a Senate meeting in the theatre of Pompey. He had been warned not to go. His wife Calpurnia had dreamed of his death. A soothsayer had reportedly told him to beware the date. He went, anyway. 23 senators were waiting for him with daggers. The first blow was struck. Caesar fought back briefly, with his writing stylus, according to one account. Then the blows came from all directions. He fell at the foot of a statue of Pompey. Of all places, he died with 23 wounds. Ancienne tradition, preserved by Suetonius, says he pulled his toga over his face as he fell, unwilling to be seen, dying, undignified. The conspirators expected celebration. They expected Rome to erupt in relief. Instead, the people were horrified. The conspirators fled for their lives. Caesar's will was read in public. He had left money to every citizen of Rome. His body was displayed in the Forum. His veterans wept. The Republic had not been saved. It had simply run out of time, because the real lesson of Caesar was not that one ambitious man had destroyed democracy. The lesson was that the Republic had been slowly hollowing itself out for 100 years. Since the first clubs had been raised over Tiberius Gracchus on the Capitoline Hill, Caesar was the crisis that finally brought it to the... What came next was not restoration. What came next was the end, and a new beginning. Part 6. The Last War of the Republic. He was 19 years old. That is the first thing to understand about the man who would become Augustus, the founder of the Roman Empire, the most consequential political figure in Western history, the man who took Rome apart and put it back together in a form that would last for centuries. When Julius Caesar was murdered on the Ides of March in 44 BC, his great-nephew and adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, was a student in the Greek city of Apollonia, studying rhetoric and military theory, waiting for his great-uncle to send for him to join a planned campaign against the Parthians. The summons never came. What came instead was a letter telling him that Caesar was dead, and that Caesar's will named him as his primary heir and adoptive son. He was now, by legal adoption, Gaius Julius Caesar. The name of the most powerful man in Roman history had just passed to a 19-year-old with no army, no political base, and no experience of either war or government. Every person around him counseled caution. Wait. Observe. Accept a modest role. Build slowly. Octavian, as historians call him during this period, sailed for Italy. What followed over the next 14 years was one of the most extraordinary political performances in human history. A masterclass in patience, ruthlessness, intelligence, and the ability to appear to be whatever each audience needed him to be, while always beneath the surface, pursuing a single goal with absolute unwavering consistency, total power. But Octavian understood something that Caesar had not. Total power in Rome had to be disguised, had to be wrapped in the language and the forms of the republic that Romans still loved. Even as they watched it die, the man who called himself king would be killed. The man who called himself the first citizen, the servant of the Senate, the humble restorer of tradition. That man might survive, but first he had to win. Rome, in the months after Caesar's death, was a city of overlapping dangers. Mark Antony, Caesar's most senior surviving lieutenant, a powerful, charismatic general, had already moved to control the city. The Senate, led by the great orator Cicero, was trying to use the young Octavian as a counterweight against Antony, assuming the boy would be manageable, useful, grateful. Cicero famously wrote, in a private letter, that the young man should be praised, honored, and then set aside. The Latin phrasing was elegant. The meaning was clear. Use the boy, then discard him. Cicero fatally misjudged his man. Octavian fought a brief campaign against Antony in northern Italy, then switched sides. He marched on Rome with Caesar's veterans, who followed him because they were devoted to Caesar's name and therefore to Caesar's heir. He demanded the consulship. He was 20 years old. The Senate, looking at legions outside the walls, gave it to him. Then Octavian joined with Antony and a general named Lepidus to form the Second Triumvirate, legally recognized by the Senate, officially granted sweeping emergency powers. They called themselves the Three Men for the restoration of the Republic. Their first act was to draw up proscription lists, hundreds of senators, thousands of wealthy Romans, men who had opposed them, men whose property they wanted, men whose names appeared for personal grievances, lost to history. Their heads were displayed in the Forum. Cicero was among the dead, hunted down on the road near his estate, killed by soldiers, his hands and head sent to Antony. According to Plutarch, Antony's wife, Fulvia, drove a pin through Cicero's tongue. Her revenge, the story goes, for years of speeches, whether literally true or not, the story was told and believed in Rome, and it tells you something about the hatred those words had accumulated. Then came Philippi, in northern Greece. 2 battles in 42 BC against Brutus and Cassius, the men who had killed Caesar. By the end, both assassins were dead, having fallen on their own swords. The last serious armed resistance to the triumvirate was gone. Now the arrangement began to fracture. Lepidus, the weakest, was gradually sidelined, given Africa to govern, kept far from the real decisions. That left 2 men. Antony took the east. Octavian took the west. The east was where the wealth was, where the ancient civilizations were, where Cleopatra was. Antony, met the Queen of Egypt in 41 BC, summoning her to appear before him at Tarsus to answer questions about her loyalty. Cleopatra's arrival, recorded by Plutarch in a passage that still reads like something between history and poetry, was on a golden barge with silver oars and purple sails, with servants dressed as sea nymphs and the scent of incense drifting across the water. The meeting Antony had planned never quite happened. He ended up at her table instead. What developed between them was genuine, a partnership that was political and personal simultaneously. Cleopatra gave Antony the resources of Egypt, the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean. Antony gave Cleopatra military protection and Roman backing. Together, they built a court in Alexandria that rivaled anything Rome could offer. Together, they had children. Together, over the years, they drifted further and further from the political realities that Octavian, watching from the west, never lost sight of for a single day. Octavian spent those years building his political base in Rome and Italy, his image as a restorer of Roman tradition and Roman values, as a man of moderation and piety. Against this image, Antony, living like an Eastern king with his Egyptian queen, giving Roman territories to Cleopatra's children, holding elaborate ceremonies in Alexandria where he and Cleopatra presented themselves as Dionysus and Isis, made an increasingly easy target. The propaganda war was continuous, and Octavian was better at it. The final break came in 32 BC. Antony formally divorced Octavian's sister, whom he had married years earlier as part of an earlier reconciliation. Octavian, in a move of questionable legality, seized Antony's will from the Vestal virgins who were keeping it and read it aloud to the Senate. The will allegedly confirmed his opponent's worst accusations. Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria, had made enormous land grants to Cleopatra's children, and treated her as a co-ruler of the Roman East. The Senate declared war, not on Antony, technically still a Roman citizen, but on Cleopatra. The decisive battle came on the 2nd of September, 31 BC, at Actium, off the western coast of Greece. Octavian's admiral Agrippa had spent the preceding weeks cutting off Antony's supply lines and maneuvering brilliantly to force the kind of naval engagement Antony could least afford. The battle began in the morning. For hours, neither side dominated. Then Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron, holding the reserve position at the rear, broke through a gap in the fighting and sailed south, toward Egypt. Whether this was a planned escape or a sudden decision, historians have argued for 2,000 years without resolution. Antony, seeing Cleopatra's sails disappearing to the south, abandoned his flagship and followed her. His fleet, leaderless and stunned, fought on for a while, then surrendered. It was over. Octavian pursued them to Egypt. Antony's remaining forces deserted. Antony, told falsely that Cleopatra had already died, fell on his sword. Badly. The wound not immediately fatal, and he lived long enough, according to Plutarch, to be carried to Cleopatra's chamber and die in her arms. Cleopatra, taken prisoner, and understanding that Octavian intended to display her in chains through the streets of Rome in his triumph, managed somehow to obtain a venomous snake, an asp, according to most ancient accounts, though some suggest poison, and died on her own terms. The last independent kingdom of the Hellenistic world was gone, and Octavian stood alone at the center of everything. Now came the performance that required his greatest skill, not the winning of wars, the construction of a new order that would not end the way Caesar's had. He was extraordinarily careful. He gave back the emergency powers the Senate had granted him during the war. He announced the restoration of the Republic, The senators gave him a standing ovation, most of them knowing perfectly well what was happening, choosing to accept it, because the alternative was another generation of civil war. In return, the Senate gave him a new title, Augustus, the revered one, carrying connotations of religious sanctity and ancient Roman authority. He was also princeps, first citizen, first among equals. Not a king, never a king, just the man whose opinion mattered most, whose presence was everywhere, whose approval was needed for everything. Even when technically it wasn't required, the genius of what Augustus built was that it preserved every visible feature of the Republic while concentrating all real power in a single pair of hands. Consuls were still elected. The Senate still met. The assemblies still voted. The legal forms were maintained with scrupulous, almost theatrical care, but Augustus controlled the armies. He controlled the provinces with armies. He controlled the money. He held a carefully assembled collection of powers, each individually legitimate under republican precedent, together amounting to something that had no precedent at all. He also, crucially, stayed in Rome, lived simply, or appeared to. His house on the Palatine Hill was, by the standards of Rome's wealthy, almost modest. He ate plain food. He wore clothes woven by his wife and daughter. He worked long hours. He was accessible to ordinary citizens who brought him petitions. He cultivated the image of a man who had saved Rome from chaos and was now simply its faithful servant. The Roman people adored him. Over the following decades, Augustus ruled for 44 years in total. He rebuilt Rome almost literally from the ground up. He repaired hundreds of temples. He constructed new public buildings across the Forum. He secured the grain supply, maintained the roads, stabilized the frontiers. He boasted, in the account of his own achievements he left behind, that he had found a city of brick and left it a city of marble. The Mediterranean world experienced a peace it had not known in a century. This was the beginning of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It would last, in various forms, for roughly 200 years. Augustus died in 14 AD, at the age of 75. His last words, as recorded by Suetonius, writing nearly a century later, and acknowledging the various versions that circulated, were addressed to his friends gathered at his bedside. He asked if he had played his part well in the comedy of life. If so, he said, give him their applause. It was what Roman audiences did at the end of a theatrical performance. The performance had lasted 44 years. It had changed the world. Part 7. The Julio-Claudians. The problem with Augustus's system was the problem every system of power eventually faces, even when it refuses to name itself what it is. What happens next? Augustus had spent decades managing the question of succession without ever answering it directly, because to answer it directly would have been to admit that what he had built was a hereditary monarchy, which was the one thing Rome's political identity could not openly accept. He adopted heirs and lost them, adopted others, maneuvered through family tragedy and political calculation with exhausting, decades-long patience. In the end, the man he left Rome to was his stepson Tiberius, a brilliant military commander, deeply intelligent, deeply private, and genuinely ambivalent about the role he was inheriting. Tiberius Julius Caesar. Augustus became the second emperor of Rome in 14 AD. He was 54 years old. He had spent decades in loyal service, won Rome's northern frontiers, administered provinces with skill and integrity. He was also a man who found the endless public performance of Roman political life genuinely distasteful. He did not want to smile and wave. He did not want to be adored. He wanted to govern well and be left in peace to do it. Rome had no patience for that. The early years of Tiberius's reign were, by most measures, genuinely good. He governed carefully. He maintained the armies. He repeatedly tried to push real decision-making back toward the Senate, insisting they exercise their own judgment. The Senate, accustomed to a generation of Augustus's gracious but firm direction, found this baffling. His silences were read as menace. His reserve was interpreted as contempt. The relationship corroded. Part of the corrosion came from a man named Sejanus. Lucius alias Sejanus was the commander of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard, an elite force of several thousand soldiers stationed in Rome. Under Augustus, the guard had been kept deliberately dispersed and low profile. Sejanus consolidated it into a single force, housed in a single camp outside the city walls. And then, exploiting Tiberius's increasing desire to withdraw from public life, he made himself indispensable. When Tiberius retreated permanently to the island of Capri, where he spent the last 11 years of his reign governing by letter, never returning to Rome, Sejanus became the effective ruler of the city. He controlled access to the emperor. He directed a wave of treason prosecutions that spread terror through the Senate. Men were accused and executed for careless words, for a look, for being related to someone who had expressed an opinion at the wrong moment. Tiberius eventually turned on Sejanus himself, having him arrested and executed in 31 AD, along with his family and allies. The political terror that followed the purge was, in its way, worse than the terror Sejanus had created. Rome had learned to live in fear of its own government. Under the final years of Tiberius, it learned to live in fear of the fear itself. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, Rome did not mourn. His successor was his great-nephew, known to history as Caligula, a nickname the soldiers had given him as a small child when he lived in army camps with his popular father, dressed in a miniature uniform with tiny military boots. Caligula means little boot. The soldiers had found it endearing. He was 24 years old, charming, apparently healthy, seemingly full of promise. Rome celebrated his accession with extraordinary relief and enthusiasm. For the first 7 months, Caligula governed well. He freed political prisoners. He abolished the hated treason trials. He treated the Senate with visible respect. Romans, who had endured the last decade of Tiberius's reign, could barely believe their good fortune. Then he fell gravely ill. He nearly died. And when he recovered, something had changed. Here we must be careful, because our primary sources for Caligula, principally Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing decades and over a century after the events respectively, are unreliable in their details, even when they agree on the broad picture. Ancient historical writing was not journalism. Authors made moral arguments through dramatic emphasis, selective inclusion, and stories that may have grown in the telling. The Caligula of the ancient sources, a man who proclaimed himself a living god, held conversations with the moon, made his horse a consul, and committed acts of cruelty for pure entertainment, almost certainly contains significant exaggeration and invention alongside whatever truth underlies it. What the sources do consistently report, and what Roman senators who lived through it confirmed in their writings, is that something went badly wrong. The treason trials resumed. Behavior toward the Senate became erratic, humiliating, and frightening. The treasury, carefully maintained under Tiberius, was emptied in less than a year. The atmosphere in Rome shifted from relief to dread. Caligula was murdered in January of 41 AD by a group of Praetorian officers in a corridor of the palace. He was 28 years old. The conspirators, intended to restore the Republic. The Senate began to debate exactly that, gathering to discuss the end of the Julio-Claudian system and the return of republican government. Then the Praetorian Guard searched the palace and found a man hiding behind a curtain. The man behind the curtain was Claudius, Caligula's uncle, a 50-year-old scholar whom the imperial family had spent decades treating as an embarrassment. He had a pronounced limp. He stuttered when nervous. He trembled. He had been kept away from politics his entire life, allowed to pursue his interests in history. He had written substantial works on Etruscan history, Carthage, the early Roman Republic, and other subjects that the court found eccentric. The guard declared him emperor. He was, it turned out, excellent at the job. Claudius governed for 13 years with genuine competence and considerable insight. He extended Roman citizenship more broadly than any emperor since Caesar. He oversaw the conquest of Britain, the island that Caesar had probed twice and never taken, that Augustus had considered and set aside, committing to it fully and achieving it, adding a large and eventually prosperous province to the empire. He reformed and professionalized the imperial bureaucracy in ways that would outlast his own reign by generations. He understood, more clearly than most of his predecessors, that running an empire required systems and procedures that would function regardless of who was emperor, not just the personal authority of the man at the center. His personal life was less successful. His third wife, Messalina, was by all ancient accounts spectacularly unfaithful, and eventually conspired against him so openly. Ancient sources, including the hostile account of Tacitus, describe her publicly marrying another man while Claudius was away from Rome, that Claudius's own staff had her executed before he could reconsider. His fourth wife was his own niece, Agrippina, a woman of formidable intelligence, absolute political ambition, and complete willingness to do whatever was necessary to secure her goals. She maneuvered successfully to have her son from a previous marriage adopted as Claudius's heir. That son was Nero. Claudius died in 54 AD. Ancient sources, including Tacitus and Suetonius, strongly suspect poisoning, and name Agrippina as the most likely candidate. On the basis that Claudius was reportedly reconsidering the succession, we cannot know with certainty. What we know is that Nero became emperor at 16, with his mother positioned to govern through him. Nero's first 5 years are known to historians as the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years. Under the guidance of the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian commander Burrus, the young emperor governed capably. The Senate was treated with courtesy. Provincial administration improved. Nero himself, who had genuine artistic interests and little appetite for the grinding details of governance, he was content to let his advisors manage the empire while he composed music and raced chariots. Then Burrus died, Seneca retired, and Nero, freed from restraint, revealed what lay beneath. In 59 AD, he arranged his mother's murder, an act so transgressive, so fundamentally contrary to every Roman value, that even the ancient sources that were accustomed to recording imperial atrocities treat it with particular horror. Agrippina had been difficult, manipulative, and genuinely dangerous. None of that made what followed acceptable in Roman eyes. A man who killed his own mother had placed himself outside the boundaries of human civilization. From this point, the reign darkened steadily. His first wife, Octavia, was divorced and then executed on fabricated charges. His second wife, Poppaea, died, kicked during an argument, according to Tacitus and Suetonius. Though the exact circumstances are uncertain, his former tutor Seneca was accused of conspiracy and forced to open his veins, dying. The ancient sources tell us, with the philosophical composure his Stoic writings had always advocated. In 64 AD, a catastrophic fire swept through Rome for 6 days and 7 nights, destroying large portions of the city. The accusation that Nero deliberately set it to clear land for his enormous new palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, has never been proven and is disputed by modern historians. The story that he played music and sang while Rome burned is almost certainly false. He appears to have been away from the city when the fire started and returned to organize relief efforts. But the palace was real, its scale genuinely extraordinary, and it inflamed resentment that was already dangerously high. Looking for someone to blame for the fire, Nero's government turned to the Christians, a small and widely unpopular sect in Rome, followers of a recently executed Jewish teacher from Judea named Jesus. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed. Some were burned alive in Nero's gardens at night, used as torches. According to the historian Tacitus, who describes the scene with evident disgust, even as he records that the victims were generally hated by the Roman public. Among those executed in Rome during this period, Christian tradition holds, were the apostles Peter and Paul. It was the first formal Roman persecution of Christians. It would not be the last. By 68 AD, Nero had accomplished something difficult. He had turned virtually every significant constituency in the empire against him. The Senate, the armies, the provincial governors. When the Praetorian Guard finally withdrew its support, Nero fled Rome and took shelter in a suburban villa. When soldiers came to arrest him, he could not bring himself to act. A servant helped him. He died with words that later sources report as a lament over the artist the world was losing. Whether he actually said them, we cannot know, but they have the quality of perfect self-revelation regardless. He was 30 years old. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was over. What came next? The year of the 4 emperors. 4 claimants in 18 months. Civil war burning through the empire demonstrated how brittle Augustus's system truly was when the wrong person sat at its center. It was Vespasian, a blunt general from a non-aristocratic family, who finally emerged from the chaos with enough military support to stabilize the empire. He founded the Flavian dynasty. He rebuilt. He restored confidence. And when his dynasty too ended, with the assassination of his younger son Domitian in 96 AD, Rome would make a choice that led to the most remarkable era in its history. But the Julio-Claudians had left their lesson clearly written. Augustus had built a system of extraordinary ingenuity. It had survived Tiberius's paranoia. It had survived Caligula's instability. It had survived Claudius's wisdom and Nero's catastrophic failures. It had survived because the empire's actual machinery, the bureaucracy, the legions, the grain supply, the roads, the provincial governors doing their daily work, was larger and more durable than any single person at its center. This was both Rome's greatest institutional achievement and its most dangerous vulnerability, because a system that could survive terrible emperors could also keep producing them, endlessly, with no reliable mechanism to identify the disaster before it arrived. Rome had not solved the problem of power. It had learned to live with it. For now. Part 8. The 5 Good Emperors. There is a sentence written by the 18th century English historian Edward Gibbon that has become one of the most quoted lines ever written about the ancient world. Gibbon wrote that if a man were asked to name the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would, without hesitation, name the period from the accession of Nerva to the death of Marcus Aurelius. That period stretched from 96 AD to 180 AD, 84 years, 5 emperors, an unbroken succession of capable, restrained, and in several cases, genuinely extraordinary men who governed the largest and most powerful state in the Western world, with a degree of wisdom that the ancient world had rarely seen and would not see again for a very long time. It did not happen by accident. The Flavian dynasty that preceded them had been, on balance, a stabilizing force. Vespasian governed for 10 years with competence and a self-deprecating humor that made him one of the more likable figures in Roman imperial history. On his deathbed, according to Suetonius, he is said to have remarked with dry amusement that he believed he was becoming a god, a joke at the expense of the tradition of posthumous deification that had become increasingly hollow. His elder son, Titus, governed for only 2 years, during which the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD buried the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum under meters of volcanic ash and stone. Titus's response: personally visiting the disaster area, organizing relief efforts, contributing generously from the imperial treasury, is one of the better documented examples of genuinely humane governance in Roman history. Then came Domitian, Vespasian's youngest son, capable administrator in some respects, effective general on the northern frontiers, and, in his later years, a source of genuine terror for the Roman Senate, executing political opponents, demanding the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and creating the kind of atmosphere of denunciations and midnight arrests that Rome had learned to dread. He was murdered in 96 AD by a conspiracy that included his wife, several Praetorian officers, and freedmen of the imperial household. He left no heir. And here, at this pivot point, Rome made a decision that changed everything about what followed. Rather than allowing the Praetorian Guard to choose the next emperor, as they had done after Nero, or leaving the question to civil war, as had happened in 69 AD, the Senate moved swiftly. They selected one of their own, a 66-year-old senator named Nerva, mild, respected, childless, who had spent his career in diplomacy and law. He was not going to conquer territory or lead armies. What he did was more important. He established a principle. Within a year of taking power, Nerva adopted a successor, not a relative, not a blood heir, but the most qualified man available. His name was Marcus Ulpius Traianus, Trajan, a general of Spanish origin commanding the Rhine legions, respected equally by the army and the Senate, the best available man, not the nearest blood relation. It sounds simple, it was revolutionary, and it worked 4 times in a row. Each of the 5 good emperors adopted his successor on merit rather than family connection, creating a chain of governance that lifted the empire to its greatest heights. Trajan became emperor in 98 AD and ruled for 19 years. He was everything Rome's political imagination had always wanted in a ruler. Brilliant general, capable administrator, personally brave, accessible to ordinary citizens, contemptuous of luxury and display. The Senate loved him so deeply that they established a formal standard against which all future emperors would be measured. Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. That title was Trajan's alone. Under Trajan, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. It conquered Dacia, roughly modern Romania, in 2 major campaigns. The victories commemorated on Trajan's column in Rome, a spiraling carved narrative that still stands in the city today, telling the entire story of the campaign in stone from bottom to top. He then turned east, conquering Mesopotamia and reaching the Persian Gulf, the furthest point any Roman army ever reached. Standing on its shore, ancient tradition holds that he looked out at the water and said he would have gone further, to India itself. If only he were younger. He was 63 years old and dying. He turned back and died on the journey home in 117 AD. His successor drew a very different lesson from those eastern campaigns. Publius Aelius Hadrianus, Hadrian, was Trajan's ward and adopted heir, a man of enormous intellectual range who had spent years studying Greek philosophy, architecture, poetry, and military theory with equal seriousness. He was also, beneath the scholarly interests, a realist about what an empire could and could not sustain. His first major act as emperor was to abandon Trajan's Mesopotamian conquests. He recognized that the empire had grown beyond its capacity to defend. The long eastern frontier was a drain on resources and manpower that could not continue indefinitely. He pulled back to more defensible lines. Then he did something no emperor had done in living memory. He traveled his empire, personally, systematically, spending years on the road, visiting every province, every frontier, every legionary camp. He walked with his soldiers, ate their food, slept in their camps. He was everywhere, and he paid attention to everything. And wherever he went, he built the Pantheon in Rome, that breathtaking circular temple with its perfect unreinforced concrete dome and its single open oculus in the ceiling, through which sunlight falls in a moving column across the marble floor, was completed under Hadrian. Rebuilt from an earlier structure, it still stands today, essentially intact. Walk inside on a winter morning when the light is sharp and cold and falls through that hole in the roof, and you are standing in Hadrian's Rome. Nothing about the building has fundamentally changed. Hadrian's Wall, stretching nearly 80 Roman miles across the north of Britain from sea to sea, was another of his projects. A physical border, a deliberate statement. Rome knew where it was. Rome knew where it ended. The wall was not built because Rome could not conquer further north. It was built because Hadrian had decided some things were not worth conquering. This was genuinely new thinking in Roman history. The empire as a defined, bounded, defensible entity rather than an ever-expanding project. And it was correct. The empire that Hadrian consolidated outlasted anything further conquest would have built. Hadrian died in 138 AD, having chosen his successor with characteristic care, Antoninus Pius, an Italian senator of impeccable character and absolute administrative competence, who governed for 23 years in a reign so peaceful, so consistently well-managed, and so thoroughly undramatic that later historians struggled to find much to write about it. That is, in its way, the highest praise imaginable. A reign during which nothing went very wrong, because the emperor did his job carefully. Every day, for more than 2 decades, is an extraordinary achievement when measured against the century of imperial history that preceded it. Antoninus died in 161 AD at the age of 74, having reportedly finished his dinner, gone to bed, and never woken up. His chosen successor took power in a seamless transition that Rome barely needed to notice. That successor was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, and he was, by the judgment of most who have studied him across 2,000 years, the closest the ancient world ever came to Plato's ideal of the philosopher king. Marcus had been identified as exceptional from boyhood. The Emperor Hadrian himself had noticed him as a child, giving him a nickname, Verissimus, meaning the most truthful or the most genuine. He had been drawn to philosophy from an early age, particularly to Stoicism, the tradition teaching that the good life consists entirely of virtue and reason, that external events lie beyond our control while our response to them does not, that the wise person neither craves pleasure nor flees pain, but meets both with steady equanimity. He had not wanted to be emperor. He had wanted to be a philosopher. Instead, he became both. Marcus Aurelius governed for 19 years, from 161 to 180 AD, and almost every one of those years was spent at war. He had inherited an empire suddenly under pressure from multiple directions at once. The Parthian Empire attacked in the east, Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni and the Quadi, pushed across the Danube in the largest and most dangerous frontier crisis Rome had faced in generations. A terrible plague, almost certainly smallpox, introduced to the empire by soldiers returning from the eastern campaigns, swept through Rome and the provinces, killing millions over decades, emptying cities, stripping whole regions of their working population. Marcus spent more of his reign on campaign than in Rome. He lived in military camps on the Danube frontier for years at a time. He fought wars he found deeply distasteful, far from the libraries and philosophical conversations he preferred. And it was there, in those camps, by the light of oil lamps, after long days of governance and battle, that he wrote the private journal we now call the Meditations. He wrote it in Greek. He never intended it to be read by anyone else. It was a private conversation with himself, a man trying, under the crushing weight of being the most powerful person in the world, to maintain the philosophical commitments he had made in better circumstances. He writes about the difficulty of patience when people disappoint you, about the temptation of anger when you have the power to indulge it, about the challenge of treating others fairly when fairness has long since become optional, about death, his own death, approached with the equanimity his philosophy required, but that clearly cost him something to maintain. One passage in particular, he writes that a man should meet each day as if it might be his last, fully present, wasting nothing, but also as if he might live for many years, because both things are true simultaneously and neither cancels the other. These were not easy words. They were hard-won words, written by a man who needed them. The Meditations were not published until centuries after Marcus's death. When they were finally read, they were read everywhere. They still are. In a world that has seen every form of power and every form of its abuse, the spectacle of the most powerful man alive, writing alone in his tent about the importance of patience, humility, and service to others carries a quality that is very difficult to name precisely, but impossible to ignore. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD at the military camp of Vindobona, the city we now call Vienna, in Austria. He was 58 years old. He had governed well, under pressures that would have broken lesser men. He had held the line, and he had made one decision that cast a long shadow over everything that came after. For the first time in nearly a century, a Roman emperor was succeeded by his biological son. Marcus's son, Commodus, was 17 years old. He was healthy and physically impressive. He was also, as it would become rapidly clear, entirely uninterested in philosophy, governance, administration, or the empire he had just inherited. The 5 good emperors had worked because each man chose his successor on the basis of ability. Marcus Aurelius chose his son. The reasons are understandable. He had watched sons die in infancy and childhood, one after another, until Commodus was the only one left. He had invested years in the boy's education. He perhaps convinced himself that what he saw was potential. He was wrong. The Golden Age was ending. Not yet broken, not yet fully cracked, but the light was already changing. Part 9. Cracks in the marble. Commodus became sole emperor in 180 AD and ruled for 12 years. He was not, in the beginning, entirely terrible. The early part of his reign showed occasional competence. He negotiated a peace on the Danube frontier that ended the exhausting wars his father had been fighting, choosing stability over military glory. But stability was not what Commodus was interested in. What he was interested in was the arena, not watching it, participating in it. He entered the gladiatorial arena himself, dressed in lion skin, carrying a club, presenting himself as Hercules reborn. He killed animals in public spectacles, ostriches, bears, hippopotami, giraffe. He fought human opponents, though those opponents were, by the accounts of Cassius Dio and others who witnessed or recorded these events, carefully selected to pose no genuine danger to the emperor. Ancient sources describe these performances in detail, and while such accounts from hostile writers must always be read with some caution, the basic fact of imperial participation in arena spectacles is attested across multiple sources. The Senate was required to attend, required to applaud. Cassius Dio, a senator who was present for some of these events, records that on one occasion Commodus beheaded an ostrich in the arena and walked toward the senatorial section, holding the head up with a meaningful expression, as if suggesting that the senators might be next. Dio writes that he and his colleagues stuffed laurel leaves into their mouths to suppress laughter. Because laughing would have been as dangerous as not laughing, he renamed Rome. The city would henceforth be called Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He renamed the months of the year after himself and his various titles. He had the head of the Colossus, the enormous bronze statue near the amphitheatre, recut to resemble his own face. The Senate voted him divine honours while he was still alive. They had no choice. It ended on the last night of 192 AD. A conspiracy of palace officials, including his own mistress and the commander of the Praetorian Guard, had him strangled in his bath by a professional wrestler. His body was removed quietly. When the Senate learned the news the following morning, they voted his memory formally condemned, his name chiselled from inscriptions, his statues pulled down, the damnatio memoriae, the official erasure. What followed was a year that showed just how fragile the structures Augustus had built truly were when the wrong person sat at their centre. In the space of 1 year, 193 AD, Rome had 5 emperors. The first, Pertinax, an honest administrator who immediately tried to reform the Praetorian Guard's privileges, lasted 87 days before the Guard murdered him. What happened next summarized the degradation of the Roman state in a single event. The Praetorian Guard put the throne up for sale. An auction, the office of Roman emperor, offered to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus paid the equivalent of enormous sums in gold to each soldier and was proclaimed emperor. He lasted 66 days before the general Septimius Severus, marching on Rome from the Danube with his legions, simply took the city. Septimius Severus was a remarkable figure. African-born, from the city of Lepsis Magna in what is now Libya, tough and capable and entirely without sentiment about the realities of power. His advice to his sons as he lay dying in 211 AD was, all by the account of Cassius Dio, characteristically direct: stay together, pay the soldiers, ignore everyone else. His sons did not stay together. Caracalla, the elder, murdered his brother Geta shortly after their father's death, allegedly while Geta was sheltering in their mother's arms, according to ancient sources, and then initiated a massive purge of his brother's supporters throughout the empire. He was murdered himself in 217 AD by a soldier whose brother he had recently killed, stabbed while pausing on the road during a military march. This was the world Rome now inhabited. The period that followed, from the death of Caracalla's dynasty until Diocletian stabilized the empire in 284 AD, is known as the crisis of the 3rd century. In approximately 50 years, Rome had somewhere between 20 and 50 emperors, depending on how you count claimants, co-emperors, and regional usurpers. The precise number is disputed by historians, but the scale is not. roughly one emperor per year. The vast majority dying violently. Feel that for a moment. One emperor per year. On average, for half a century. The most powerful office in the Western world. Cycling through men at the speed of assassination. The causes were multiple and interlocking. In the East, the old Parthian Empire had been replaced by the far more aggressive Sassanid Persian Empire, which invaded Roman territory repeatedly, and in 260 AD achieved something almost inconceivable: the capture of a Roman emperor in battle. Valerian, campaigning in Syria, was taken prisoner by the Sassanid king Shapur I. He spent the rest of his life in Persian captivity. The Sassanid records preserve this victory in enormous carved stone reliefs that still stand today. Shapur on horseback, the Roman emperor kneeling before him. The humiliation was total, and its psychological impact on the Roman world was severe. On the Rhine and Danube frontiers, Germanic tribes, Alemanni, Franks, Goths, and others, were pressing into Roman territory with increasing force. These were not the tribes Caesar had faced. They had spent 2 centuries in contact with Rome, had traded with Rome, had served in Roman armies, had absorbed Roman military techniques. They were increasingly organized, increasingly formidable. Inside the empire, continuous military campaigns had forced successive emperors to debase the currency, reducing the silver content of Roman coins to fund their armies. This caused inflation, disrupted trade, and undermined the commercial networks that had sustained Roman prosperity for generations. Plague swept through the empire in waves, killing enormous numbers of people and depopulating agricultural regions that struggled to recover. In 260 AD, the empire fractured into 3 pieces. The Gallic Empire, comprising Gaul, Britain, and Spain, broke away under a general named Postumus, who had more immediate problems to solve than loyalty to a distant and ineffective central government. The Palmyrene Empire, centered on the great desert city of Palmyra in Syria, established itself under the Queen Zenobia, a multilingual, politically formidable ruler who governed on behalf of her young son, controlled Egypt and much of the East, and presented herself as heir to the queens of the ancient world. And a rump central empire controlled Italy, North Africa, and the Balkans. Zenobia is worth pausing on. She reportedly rode on horseback rather than in a litter. She studied philosophy and history seriously. She traced her lineage to Cleopatra. She governed her expanded territories with notable capability. She challenged Rome not as a barbarian raider, but as a rival civilization. For several years, the challenge was entirely credible. The man who put the empire back together was Aurelian, who came to the throne in 270 AD and immediately brought the focused, relentless energy the situation required. He defeated Germanic incursions. He marched east and defeated Zenobia's forces at the Battle of Imai in 272 AD, captured Zenobia herself, and brought her to Rome, where she was, notably, treated with significant respect, eventually given a villa near Tivoli, where she lived as a Roman aristocrat. Then he marched west and absorbed the Gallic Empire, reuniting all 3 fragments under a single authority. His soldiers called him Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. He also built the Aurelian Wall, the massive circuit of defensive walls around Rome that still stands today in large sections, their red brick visible from certain angles when you walk the city. The fact that Rome now needed a wall speaks volumes. For most of its history, the city had been so deep within its own territory that defensive walls were simply unnecessary. The fact that Aurelian judged them essential tells you, in stone and mortar, how far the world had shifted. Aurelian was murdered in 275 AD by officers who had apparently been tricked into believing he was about to execute them. The empire passed through several more short-lived rulers until Diocletian, a career soldier from the Balkans, took the throne in 284 AD and proceeded to impose order with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had watched chaos his entire career and had definite ideas about how to end it. Diocletian's solution was radical in its simplicity. The empire was too large for one man to govern. The frontiers were too long. The crises too frequent. The distances too vast for a single ruler based in Rome to respond quickly enough to threats that could arise anywhere from Britain to Mesopotamia. So he created two emperors, himself and a colleague, and then added two junior emperors beneath them, creating a system of 4 rulers he called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. For as long as Diocletian's personal authority held the system together, it worked. Frontiers stabilized. Administrative efficiency improved. The currency was reformed. New bureaucratic structures were created. Diocletian also initiated the last and most severe persecution of Christians in the empire's history, destroying churches, burning scriptures, executing clergy and lay people alike in a sustained campaign lasting years. His reasons were partly religious, partly practical. Christians had been growing in numbers and influence throughout the empire for 2 centuries, and their refusal to participate in traditional Roman religious ceremonies tied to civic and military life made them, in the eyes of a deeply traditional man like Diocletian, a source of dangerous social disorder. The persecution failed. The church survived, and when Diocletian retired from power in 305 AD, the only Roman emperor who voluntarily resigned, withdrawing to an enormous palace he had built on the Dalmatian coast to, according to later tradition, grow cabbages. The carefully constructed system he had built began, almost immediately, to dissolve. Civil war. Again. Multiple claimants. Again. But this time, one of them would bring something entirely new to the conflict. Something that would change not just Rome, but the entire subsequent history of Western civilization. His name was Constantine. He had an army, and he had a vision. Part 10. Constantine and the New Rome. On the 28th of October, 312 AD, 2 armies faced each other north of Rome at a crossing of the Tiber called the Milvian Bridge. On one side stood Maxentius, who controlled Italy, had ruled Rome itself for 6 years, and had positioned his forces with the river at his back in a defensive arrangement that would prove catastrophic. On the other side stood Constantine, who had fought his way through a decade of civil wars among Diocletian's would-be successors, and was now one battle away from control of the entire Western Empire. What happened in Constantine's mind in the hours before that battle is one of the most debated questions in all of Western history. The story Constantine later told, and that his biographer Eusebius of Caesarea recorded, writing after Constantine's death, was this: in the sky above his army, Constantine saw a vision, a cross of light above the sun, with words inscribed across it. In this sign, Conquer. That night, he dreamed that Christ appeared and instructed him to mark his soldiers' shields with the Christian symbol. He did. His army fought under the Christian monogram, and he won. Maxentius's forces, retreating toward the bridge, found that a pontoon bridge had given way. Maxentius himself drowned in the Tiber. Weighed down by his armor, his head was carried through Rome on a pike. Now, what exactly Constantine saw or believed before Milvian Bridge is genuinely unknowable at this distance. He may have had a sincere religious experience. He may have witnessed a natural atmospheric phenomenon interpreted through existing beliefs. He may have made a calculated political decision to align himself with the fastest-growing religious movement in the empire and constructed a narrative around it afterward. Most likely some combination of all three. We cannot know. What we can know is what he did with it. In 313 AD, Constantine and his eastern co-emperor Licinius issued what is known as the Edict of Milan, a document establishing general religious toleration throughout the empire, explicitly including Christians, restoring property seized during the Diocletianic persecution, and ending official discrimination against Christian worship. After 300 years of intermittent persecution, Christians were free. The effect was immediate and sweeping. Imperial patronage flowed toward the church. Enormous basilicas rose across Rome. Christian clergy received tax exemptions and legal privileges. The church, which had spent centuries surviving as a minority sect, found itself suddenly and almost overwhelmingly in possession of imperial favor. It grew rapidly, and as it grew, the theological disagreements that had always existed within it became political problems. The most urgent of these was the Arian controversy, a dispute about the precise nature of Jesus Christ that divided the Christian world and threatened to split the empire along with it. The details of the theological argument are complex, but the political consequences were real and immediate. Entire provinces lined up on opposing sides. Riots broke out in Alexandria. The fracture ran through every corner of the church. Constantine, whose primary concern was unity rather than theology, and who appears to have found the subtleties of the debate genuinely baffling, convened a council of bishops from across the empire to settle the matter. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD was the first ecumenical council of the Christian Church, the first time bishops from the entire Christian world gathered in one place to determine what Christianity officially believed. The council produced the Nicene Creed, establishing the orthodox position on Christ's nature, and condemned the opposing view. The matter was, officially, resolved. It was not actually resolved for another century, but the Council of Nicaea established something that outlasted the controversy: the principle that the emperor and the church would work together to define and enforce Christian orthodoxy. That partnership between imperial power and religious authority would shape European civilization for more than 1,000 years. Constantine spent the rest of his reign fighting the civil wars that the Tetrarchy's collapse had generated, and building what he built, most significantly, was a new capital, on the site of an ancient Greek colony called Byzantium, at the extraordinary geographic point where Europe meets Asia, where the Bosphorus Strait connects the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara. Constantine constructed a new city. He laid it out personally, pacing out the boundaries with a spear, telling his astonished advisors, according to ancient tradition, that he was following a divine guide only he could see. The city was dedicated in 330 AD. It was initially called Nova Roma, New Rome. It would come to be known as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The choice of location was inspired. The peninsula on which it sat was naturally defensible on three sides by water, requiring only a single land wall to create an almost impregnable fortress. It controlled the shipping route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Every ship traveling between them had to pass through its harbors. It was closer to the empire's wealthiest and most populous eastern provinces, and it was far from Rome. With all of Rome's entrenched aristocratic families and accumulated political complexity, a new city, a new start. Constantine died in 337 AD, having delayed his baptism until his deathbed, a practice reflecting the widespread belief that baptism washed away all sins and was therefore most strategically received as late as possible. He died as a baptized Christian, the first Roman emperor to do so. The empire he left passed through the usual bloodshed of succession, through various capable and incapable hands, A brief interlude under the Emperor Julian, Constantine's nephew, who rejected Christianity, attempted to restore traditional Roman religion, and earned the lasting Christian nickname Julian the Apostate, ended when Julian died on campaign against the Persians in 363 AD, struck by a spear in the chaos of battle. The circumstances were disputed even at the time. The final significant act in the story of the unified empire came in 395 AD. The Emperor Theodosius I, who had in 380 AD made Christianity the exclusive official religion of the Roman Empire, completing the transformation Constantine had begun, died after a reign that had, with considerable effort, kept the empire's various pieces functioning together. He divided it between his two sons. Arcadius, 17 years old, received the east. Honorius, 10 years old, received the west. The empire was divided. It would never be reunited. The eastern half would survive for over 1,000 years more. The western half entered a period of accelerating crisis that would end within 80 years, in the disappearance of something that had existed, in one form or another, for over 1,000 years. The end was coming, not like a storm, like a tide. Part 11. Barbarians at the gates. The Western Roman Empire did not fall like a tree in a storm. Suddenly, violently, with one definitive crack, it fell the way a building falls when its foundations have been slowly eaten away. A long period of invisible damage. A gradual settling. A few cracks in the plaster that everyone hopes are superficial. And then, finally, a collapse that seems sudden only to those who had not been paying attention to the foundations. The catalyst. The external shock that accelerated slow decline into catastrophic failure came from the east, from the vast grasslands of Central Asia, from a people about whom the Romans knew almost nothing. The Huns. Who exactly the Huns were, where they came from, what language they spoke. These questions remain genuinely contested among historians. What is not in dispute is the effect of their appearance on the peoples they encountered. The Huns were horse nomads of devastating military effectiveness. They were superb riders and archers, capable of loosing arrows accurately at full gallop. They were fast, mobile, and psychologically terrifying to the settled farming peoples in their path. In the 370s AD, they swept westward across the steppe north of the Black Sea and fell upon the Gothic peoples settled there. The Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, Germanic peoples who had been in contact with Rome for generations. The Huns destroyed the Ostrogothic kingdom. The Visigoths, trapped between the Huns behind them and the Danube River, and the Roman Empire, before them, made a desperate appeal to Rome. They asked permission to cross the river and settle inside the empire's borders. This was not unprecedented. Rome had accepted Germanic settlers before. The Visigoths were Christians. Many had Roman connections. The Eastern Emperor Valens agreed. In 376 AD, an estimated 200,000 Visigoths, men, women, and children, crossed the Danube. What followed was a catastrophe born of Roman corruption and administrative failure. The officials responsible for receiving and settling the Visigoths treated them with extortionate cruelty, confiscating weapons, demanding bribes. According to the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, exchanging dog meat for Visigothic children taken as slaves. The Visigoths, hungry, partly rearmed, and burning with fury, rose in revolt. At the Battle of Adrianople on the 9th of August, 378 AD, the Emperor Valens attacked the Visigothic encampment without waiting for his western colleague to arrive with reinforcements. The Gothic cavalry, which Valens had critically underestimated, arrived and struck the Roman flanks. The encirclement was swift and total. Ancient sources report the loss of 2/3 of the Roman army. Valens himself died in the fighting. His body was never recovered, and later sources give varying accounts of exactly how he died. It was the worst Roman military defeat since Cannae. And, unlike Cannae, Rome could not simply raise new legions and return stronger. The population base, the agricultural capacity, the economic resilience that had once let Rome absorb devastating losses. All of these had been reduced over the preceding century of crisis. The recovery was slower. The scars remained. Theodosius, who became emperor after Valens's death, made peace with the Visigoths on terms that would have seemed extraordinary a century earlier. They were settled within the empire as autonomous federate allies, fighting for Rome under their own leaders, by their own customs, without integrating into Roman society. They were inside the empire but not of it. This arrangement, settling entire peoples as autonomous federates, became increasingly common over the following decades, as each iteration weakened the empire's internal coherence a little further. The legions were increasingly composed of men whose loyalty ran to their own commanders rather than to Rome, whose languages were not Latin, whose worlds were not Roman. The Western Empire, in the early 5th century, was a strange hybrid. Nominally Roman, increasingly governed by Germanic generals who held the real power, while emperors in the heavily fortified city of Ravenna served as increasingly ceremonial figures. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, who had been repeatedly promised rewards for his service and repeatedly betrayed, sacked Rome. The psychological impact is almost impossible to overstate. Rome had not been taken by an enemy in 800 years. Rome was not merely a city, it was the eternal city. The city the gods had promised would last forever. The center of civilization itself. And now the streets of Rome echoed with the sound of foreign boots. Saint Jerome, one of the greatest Christian scholars of the era. He was in Bethlehem when the news reached him. He wrote that he could not speak, that sobs interrupted every attempt at words. The city that had conquered the whole world, he said, had itself been conquered. The sack lasted 3 days. Alaric had given orders that churches and those sheltering in them were to be spared, a constraint that limited the violence, though did not eliminate it. By the standards of ancient sieges, the sack of Rome in 410 was relatively restrained. By the standards of what Rome had meant to the world, it was catastrophic. The symbolic wound never healed. The 5th century brought a cascade of losses. The Vandals crossed into North Africa and established a kingdom that cut the Western Empire off from its most vital agricultural province, the region that had fed Rome for centuries. Attila, the Hun, who had consolidated the various Hun tribes into a formidable empire on the Pannonian Plain in Central Europe, launched devastating raids into both the Eastern and Western empires throughout the 440s AD. In 451 AD, at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains in Gaul, one of the largest battles of the ancient world, involving a Roman force under the general Aetius fighting alongside Visigothic allies against Attila's combined force. The Hun advance into Western Europe was stopped. It was one of the last great Roman military victories in the West. Attila turned south into Italy the following year, sacking cities in the north but stopping short of Rome. The traditional account holds that Pope Leo I met Attila near the Mincio River and persuaded him to withdraw. Divine intervention, in the eyes of the faithful. More practically, Attila's army was suffering from disease and supply problems, and the Eastern Empire was threatening his rear. He withdrew and died the following year, 453 AD, reportedly of a hemorrhage on his wedding night. His vast empire fragmented immediately after his death. But Rome had no more Aetius. The great general was murdered by the Emperor Valentinian III. The emperor, apparently jealous of his fame and influence. Valentinian himself was murdered the following year by two of Aetius's former bodyguards. Avenging their commander, emperors killing their best generals. Generals' men killing the emperors. Civil wars blooming and withering in the space of months. The last Western emperor worth naming as a ruler rather than a figurehead was Julius Nepos. Overthrown in 475 AD by his own military commander, a general named Orestes, who installed his own young son on the throne. That son's name, in one of history's more pointed ironies, was Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, like the founder, Augustus, like the first emperor, a child carrying the greatest names in Roman history into the empire's final days. He lasted less than a year. On the 4th of September, 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer, commanding Federate troops who had not received the land grants they had been promised, deposed Romulus Augustulus. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. He did not bother appointing a new Western emperor. He ruled Italy himself, under the nominal authority of the Eastern emperor. That is the date the textbooks give. 476 AD. The fall of the Western Roman Empire. But it is worth sitting with what that date actually represents, because no one on that day rang a bell and announced that civilization had ended. Odoacer continued using Roman administrative structures and Roman legal forms. Latin remained the language of government. The Senate continued to meet. People went to market, baked bread, argued with their neighbors, fell in love, buried their dead. What had ended was not Roman civilization. What had ended was the Western emperor, a position that had become so hollowed out, so dependent on Germanic commanders who held all real military power, that its disappearance felt less like a demolition and more like the removal of a facade from a building that had already quietly emptied. The building had been coming down for a long time. Why it fell? This question has generated more scholarly debate than almost any other in history. Climate change, plague, economic decline, military overextension, political dysfunction, the debasement of the currency, the changing character of the army, the loss of civic identity. Historians have argued for all of these causes and will go on arguing. The honest answer is almost certainly all of them together, reinforcing each other over centuries in ways too gradual for anyone living through it to see clearly. The people who lived through the fall of the Western Roman Empire did not experience it as a single catastrophe. They experienced it as a series of harder decades, the roads deteriorating, trade becoming more dangerous, the coins in their pockets buying a little less each year, the soldiers who used to keep order replaced by other soldiers, speaking different languages, following different customs. Life went on, more locally, more precariously, with less of the extraordinary connected infrastructure that had made Roman civilization possible. But in the East, the light had not gone out, and in the East, one last extraordinary effort was being prepared. One final attempt to reclaim what had been lost, to restore the name and the power of Rome to the world it had once governed entirely. Part 12. The Eastern Flame. Constantinople did not fall in 476 AD, while Odoacer was deposing the last Western emperor and sending the imperial regalia east as a gesture of nominal submission. The city on the Bosphorus was fully alive, its harbour crowded with ships from across the Mediterranean, its great markets loud and fragrant with the commerce of 3 continents, its triple land walls standing exactly as Theodosius II had built them 50 years before, intact and formidable, and seemingly permanent. The Eastern Roman Empire. which we call the Byzantine Empire, though its inhabitants never used that name, always calling themselves Romans, always calling their state the Roman Empire, would endure for nearly 1,000 years after the Western collapse. It would survive invasions, plagues, religious controversies, coup, and the rise of Islam. It would preserve Roman law and Greek intellectual tradition through centuries, when much of Western Europe had access to neither, and at one extraordinary moment in the 6th century, under one of the most remarkable rulers in the entire Roman tradition, it came very close to putting the empire back together. That ruler was Justinian, and his story begins not in a palace, but on a farm in the Balkans. Flavius Petrus Sabatius Justinianus was born around 482 AD in a small village in what is now North Macedonia. His family were peasants, Latin-speaking, in an increasingly Greek world, obscure in a court that valued ancestry. His uncle, a capable soldier named Justin, had risen through the army and, through a combination of military ability and political fortune, had become emperor in 518 AD. Justin had no children. He brought his nephew to Constantinople, educated him, relied on him. When Justin died in 527 AD, Justinian became emperor at approximately 45 years of age. He would reign for 38 years. Before we follow those years, we need to meet the woman beside him. Because to understand Justinian fully is to understand that at the most critical moment of his reign, he was the man Theodora allowed him to be. Theodora was the daughter of a bear keeper at the Constantinople Hippodrome. She had worked as an actress, a profession that carried, in Byzantine society, significant social stigma. She was brilliant, politically acute, physically striking, and possessed of a personal courage she would demonstrate when it mattered most. When Justinian met her, she had left the stage and was working as a wool spinner. Roman law forbade senators from marrying actresses. Justinian had the law changed. He married her. He made her empress. The court was appalled. They never entirely forgave either of them. In 532 AD, 18 months into Justinian's sole reign, Constantinople erupted in the most dangerous urban revolt in Byzantine history. It began as a conflict between the great chariot racing factions of the Hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, and rapidly became something far more threatening. As political grievances attached themselves to the factional violence, the city burned for 5 days. Tens of thousands died. A rival emperor was acclaimed in the Hippodrome. Justinian's advisors were organizing his escape by sea. Theodora refused to leave. She sat in the throne room while her husband and his generals debated flight. And she spoke. Her words are preserved in the Chronicle of Procopius, who was present. She said she would not flee. She said that purple made a fine burial shroud. She said that a ruler who had tasted power could not endure exile, and that she preferred to die as empress rather than live as a refugee. Justinian stayed. His generals went into the city. In the Hippodrome, where the rebels had gathered, the fighting was brutal and decisive. The revolt was over. He spent the next 30 years rebuilding the Roman world. His greatest legal achievement was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. A team of brilliant scholars, led by a jurist named Tribonian, spent years assembling, organizing, and rationalizing the entire accumulated body of Roman law. Centuries of imperial edicts, Senate decrees, legal commentary, and judicial decisions into a coherent and systematic code. The resulting work was the most comprehensive statement of legal principles the ancient world had ever produced. Its influence is one of the most direct and traceable in all of legal history. The civil law tradition that governs most of continental Europe, Latin America, and large parts of the wider world today traces its foundations directly to Justinian's code. When lawyers and judges in France, Italy, Brazil, or Japan work within their legal systems, they are working, at however many removes, within a framework that Tribonian and his colleagues assembled in 6th century Constantinople. In 537 AD, Justinian dedicated a building, the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, rose above Constantinople on a scale that had never been attempted. Its central dome, approximately 32 meters in internal diameter and rising 55 meters above the floor, appeared to everyone who entered to float. The base of the dome was ringed by 40 windows that filled the interior with diffuse light so omnipresent that it seemed to have no single source. The court historian Procopius wrote that the dome seemed suspended from heaven by a golden chain. He was trying to describe something that language was not quite built for. Stand inside it today. It has been a mosque since the 15th century and a museum since the 20th, and is now returned to use as a mosque. And what Procopius was reaching for becomes immediately clear. The light in that building does something that light in other buildings does not do. It behaves differently. It has a quality that is not quite architectural and not quite spiritual and is somehow both simultaneously. The building was completed in less than 6 years. It remained the largest interior space in the world for nearly 1,000 years. Justinian reportedly stood beneath its dome at its dedication and said, whether these exact words were spoken or were attributed to him later, they are preserved in the tradition. Solomon, I have surpassed thee. His military campaigns were equally ambitious and considerably more costly. In 533 AD, his greatest general, Belisarius, landed in North Africa with a force that ancient sources put at around 15,000 men and destroyed the Vandal kingdom that had controlled the region for a century, returning to Constantinople within a year with the Vandal king in chains. A stunning, almost improbable achievement. Then Belisarius went to Italy. What had been expected as a swift reconquest became a grinding, devastating war that lasted 20 years and left Italy in worse condition than the barbarian kingdoms it replaced. The Ostrogoths, who had controlled Italy since the late 5th century, fought with tenacity and intelligence. Rome changed hands multiple times. Its population, which had been hundreds of thousands in the imperial period, was reduced by war, famine, and plague to perhaps tens of thousands. The aqueducts were cut. The Senate ceased to function meaningfully. By the time the war ended in 554 AD, Italy was nominally Roman again, but the Italy that Justinian reclaimed was a devastated shadow of what had existed before. The reconquest had cost far more than it was worth, and even as Justinian poured resources into Italy, a new catastrophe was spreading from Egypt. The plague of Justinian, which struck in 541 AD and recurred in waves for the next 2 centuries, was almost certainly bubonic plague, the same bacterium that would devastate Europe in the 14th century as the Black Death. Constantinople, at its peak, may have been losing thousands of people a day. The emperor himself contracted the disease and recovered. But the administrative and military disruptions caused by mass mortality undid years of careful work across the empire. Justinian died in 565 AD, at approximately 83 years of age. He had rebuilt the legal system of Rome, constructed the greatest building of the late ancient world, and reconquered large portions of the Western Mediterranean. He had also exhausted the treasury, left Italy devastated, and passed on an empire that was structurally overextended. The reconquered Western territories did not hold. Within 3 years of his death, the Lombards invaded Italy and took most of it. The empire contracted, and then contracted again. In the 7th century, The world changed with a speed that no one in Constantinople had anticipated. From the Arabian Peninsula, a new religious and political force erupted with extraordinary energy. Islam, united under the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad and carried by armies that had spent generations fighting each other across the desert, now directed their formidable military culture outward. Within a decade of Muhammad's death, in 632 AD, Arab armies had taken Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, three of the wealthiest and most strategically vital Byzantine provinces. Within 2 decades, they had destroyed the Sassanid Persian Empire entirely. The loss of Egypt was, for Byzantium, existential in its implications. Egypt was not merely a province. It was the breadbasket, the source of grain, the economic engine of the Eastern Mediterranean. The empire that remained after the Arab conquests was much smaller, considerably poorer, and fundamentally changed. But it did not fall. Constantinople held Arab sieges in 674 AD, and again in 717 AD, broke against the Great Walls and against the Byzantine navy's use of Greek fire. An incendiary compound that burned on water and resisted extinguishing one of the most feared weapons of the medieval world. The city that Theodosius had walled and Constantine had built and Justinian had adorned proved, generation after generation, impregnable to everything thrown against it. The following centuries brought new pressures. The Bulgars from the north, further Arab pressure from the east, a great religious controversy over the use of religious images that fractured the church internally. The Great Schism of 1054 AD formally separated the Catholic and Orthodox churches, a division that persists today, culminating centuries of tension between Rome and Constantinople over theology, authority, and the direction of Christianity. Then came the ultimate irony. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202 AD, ostensibly to defend the Holy Land, was diverted by Venetian commercial interests and factional politics until it ended with Western Christian armies besieging and sacking Constantinople. The city that had served as the shield of Christendom for over 800 years was looted by the people it had been protecting. The Hagia Sophia was stripped of its treasures. The great bronze horses from the Hippodrome were taken to Venice, where they still stand above the portal of St. Mark's Basilica today. The Byzantine Empire was restored in 1261 AD, but never recovered its former strength. What remained was essentially the city itself, a few territories in Greece and Anatolia, and the prestige of a name. The end came from the east, as so many of Rome's endings had. The Ottoman Turks had been expanding steadily across Anatolia for a century, absorbing former Byzantine territory, pressing ever closer to Constantinople. By the mid-15th century, the city was an island, surrounded on all sides by Ottoman territory, accessible only by sea. Its population reduced from the hundreds of thousands of Justinian's era to perhaps 50,000. On the 29th of May, 1453 AD, after a 53-day siege, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, 21 years old, brilliant and deliberate, breached the walls of Constantinople. He had brought enormous bronze cannons, the largest yet built, that could shatter stonework no previous weapon had touched. The walls that had stood for 1,000 years finally gave way. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, carrying with almost unbearable historical symmetry the name of the man who had built the city 1,100 years before, died fighting in the final breach. His body was never identified with certainty. Mehmed rode his horse into the Hagia Sophia. He looked up at the dome. He ordered it converted into a mosque. He sat down on the floor, pressed his face into the dust, and gave thanks to God. He called himself From that day forward, Caesari Rum, Caesar of Rome, the Eastern Roman Empire had lasted. From the traditional founding of the city of Rome in 753 BC, nearly 2,200 years in one continuous tradition. Counting from Augustus alone, nearly 1,500. No political entity in the history of Western civilization comes close to that record of continuity. And in the years before and after Constantinople fell, the scholars, monks, and administrators who fled the dying empire carried with them the manuscripts they had spent centuries preserving, the works of Plato and Aristotle, of Thucydides and Euclid and Archimedes, texts that had survived the fall of the West only because Byzantine scribes had kept copying them, century after patient century. In the great libraries of the Eastern Empire, they carried them west, to Florence, to Venice, to Rome itself, and the scholars who received those manuscripts, who read them, argued over them, built on them, called what was happening a rebirth, a renaissance. The last embers of Rome, carried in the hands of refugees from a fallen city, lit the fire of the modern world. Part 13. What Rome left behind. Stand in the center of Rome today. Not in a museum. Not following a tour group with a raised umbrella. Just stand still, somewhere in the middle of the ancient city. And look, the Pantheon is nearly 2,000 years old. Its unreinforced concrete dome, a feat of engineering that modern architects study and still find remarkable, has never required fundamental structural repair. The building is essentially identical to what Hadrian dedicated in 125 AD. On a winter morning, sunlight enters through the oculus, the open hole at the dome's apex, and falls across the marble floor in a slow-moving column of light. People walk into that column and stand in it, feeling something they often struggle to name. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 people. Its system of vaulted corridors and numbered entrances allowed the entire audience to reach their seats and leave again, with an efficiency that modern stadium designers have explicitly studied, in many cases. Directly adopted, the retractable canvas awning system that shaded the crowd on hot days required teams of sailors from the imperial fleet to operate, because the mechanics of rigging it were essentially the same as rigging sails. The road you drive on, in most European cities, runs above foundations that Roman engineers surveyed. Buildings across England, France, Spain, and Germany rest on Roman foundations, many of them still the deepest and most stable layer beneath modern streets. In Bath, in England, visitors walk past thermal baths built in the 1st century AD that still channel the same hot spring water that Roman soldiers soaked in after marching up from the south coast. But Rome's legacy is not primarily stone. Stone is the most visible part, the part durable enough to photograph. The deeper inheritance is in the invisible architecture of the civilization we inhabit. Much of the legal tradition underlying modern Western legal systems was shaped, either directly or through long chains of influence, by Roman law. The principle that you are innocent until proven guilty traces to Roman legal thought. The right to face your accusers. The concept that a law must be publicly known before it can be enforced. The distinction between civil and criminal jurisdiction. These ideas passed from Roman practice into the Corpus Juris Civilis, from there into medieval European legal education, and from there into the legal codes that govern much of the world today. The civil law tradition of continental Europe, Latin America, and many other regions is, at its foundation, Roman law adapted across centuries. When the framers of the American Constitution gathered in Philadelphia in 1787, they were thinking explicitly about Rome, about the Republic, the Senate, the system of checks designed to prevent any single person from accumulating unchecked power. The warnings about the moment when republics decline into something else. They had read Polybius. They had read Cicero. They named their legislative body after the institution that had governed Rome for 5 centuries. They named a new city in Ohio Cincinnati, after the Roman general Cincinnatus, who had twice been given dictatorial power and twice voluntarily given it back to return to his farm. They knew the references. They meant them. The languages spoken by approximately 800 million people as their first language are Roman. Latin did not die when Rome fell. It transformed. In Gaul, it became French. In Iberia, it became Spanish and Portuguese. In the Italian peninsula, it became Italian. In the Eastern Balkans, it became Romanian. These languages, along with Catalan and Occitan and others, are called the Romance languages, from the word Roman, and they carry inside them, preserved across 15 centuries of change, the sounds and structures and vocabulary of the tongue Roman soldiers spoke in their camps on the Rhine and the Danube and the Thames, and English, which is not a Romance language in its fundamental structure, borrowed so extensively from Latin and from French, which is Latin transformed, that a significant portion of its vocabulary has Latin roots. When you use the words justice, liberty, republic, senate, constitution, nation, empire, military, legal, civil, urban, rural, domestic, foreign, education, science, medicina, you are using Latin. When a doctor writes a prescription, the abbreviations are Latin. When a scientist names a new species, the convention is Latin and Greek. When a lawyer argues a technical point before a court, the terminology is Latin. Rome is present in the language you are hearing right now. The calendar you use is Roman. Julius Caesar reformed the old Roman calendar in 46 BC, creating the Julian calendar, 365 days, with a leap year every 4 years. Pope Gregory adjusted it slightly in 1582 AD, and what resulted, the Gregorian calendar, is what the world uses today. The months are Roman. January from Janus, the god of beginnings. March from Mars. July from Julius Caesar. August from Augustus. September. October. November. December. The 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months, from the Latin numbers, bearing their original positions in a calendar that predates even Caesar's reform. Every morning when you look at a date, you are looking at Rome. The Catholic Church is the most direct institutional heir of Rome that still exists in recognizable form. It is governed from Rome. Its universal language, until very recently, was Latin. Its organizational structure, diocese, province, the hierarchy of bishops and archbishops, reporting to a central authority, mirrors the administrative structure of the Roman Empire. The Pope's ancient title, Pontifex Maximus, was a title of Augustus. It means, roughly, the greatest bridge builder, the one who mediates between human and divine. Augustus used it to anchor his authority in religious tradition. The papacy inherited it and has never given it back. And beyond all of this, beyond the laws and the languages and the calendars and the institutions, Rome gave the Western world something harder to quantify, but perhaps more important than any of it. A story about what civilization could look like at its best, and a warning about what it becomes at its worst. Every monarch who called himself a Caesar was reaching back to Rome. Charlemagne, crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in 800 AD, was presenting himself explicitly as the heir of Augustus. The Ottoman sultans, as we have just seen, claim the same title. The Russian word Tsar is Caesar. The German word Kaiser is Caesar. 3 empires, 3 languages, 3 different centuries, all reaching back to the same man, all claiming the same inheritance. The warnings Rome offered are just as present as the aspirations. Every generation that has worried about the concentration of power in too few hands, about the moment a republic begins its drift towards something else, about the costs of endless military expansion, about the gap between the wealth of the few and the precarity of the many. Every generation that has worried about these things has found, when it looked for a language to describe them, that Rome had already described them first. In the writings of Cicero, in the histories of Livy and Tacitus, in the private journal of Marcus Aurelius, written in a military camp on a dangerous frontier by a man who was trying, against considerable odds, to remain worthy of the power he had been given. Those words are still being read, still being underlined, still being returned to on difficult nights by people who have never heard of the Danube frontier and never will. That is what civilizations leave behind when they are gone. Not only roads and laws and alphabets, but ways of thinking about what it means to be a human being, facing a world that will not cooperate, holding power you did not entirely ask for, trying to do something worthy with the time you have. Rome tried for nearly 1,500 years. In one form or another, Rome tried, and the trying, the whole extraordinary, contradictory, brutal, magnificent, endlessly instructive trying, became part of the architecture of the world. And so the story of Rome comes to its close. From 2 brothers on a hill above a muddy river, to the last emperor, falling at the walls of Constantinople 1,100 years later, from mud huts on the Palatine, to the largest empire the Western world has ever seen, from the she-wolf and the founding legend, to the dome of the Hagia Sophia and the legal codes that still quietly govern nations today. It is a story of extraordinary human achievement and extraordinary human failure, sometimes separated by a single generation, sometimes present in the same person at the same moment. What stays with me, after all of it, is not the battles, not the emperors, not the monuments, though the monuments are extraordinary. It is something smaller. It is the image of Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man alive, writing alone in a military camp on the Danube frontier by the light of an oil lamp, trying to remind himself to be patient, to be fair, to remember that all of it, the purple robes, the legions, the empire stretching from the Atlantic to Mesopotamia, was temporary, that what mattered was not what you commanded or owned, but how you chose to live the hours you were given. He wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. 2,000 years later, those words are still being read, still being copied into journals and written on note cards and returned to when ordinary life becomes difficult, by people who have never heard of the Danube frontier and never will, by people who have no particular reason to care about the Roman Empire at all, except that somewhere, in the middle of a hard night, someone opened a book written by a man who was also having a hard night, in a tent, far from home, a long time ago, and it helped. That is the real legacy of Rome, not the roads, though the roads were remarkable, not the law, though the law shaped the world, not the language, though the language is everywhere. The real legacy is that human beings, struggling with the same difficulties across 20 centuries, keep finding in Rome a mirror, a warning, a question worth sitting with. What will you do with the power you have been given? How will you treat the people who depend on you? What do you owe to the civilization that made you possible? Rome answered those questions well. And badly. And every gradation in between. It answered them in the Senate and on the battlefield, and in slave markets, and in the marble palaces of the Forum, and in the private journals of a philosopher king writing by lamplight, while the barbarians gathered on the other side of the river. The answers Rome gave are still with us, still worth reading, and the questions are still being asked. Thank you for spending this night with me, traveling through the longest and most extraordinary story the Western world has to tell. If any part of this journey stayed with you, a moment, a name, a question you want to follow further, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Until next time, sleep well